everybody, it's Mr. Wagstaff. We're going to start talking about some new stuff now here in civics as we start a new unit here. This unit is going to be on political parties, elections, and voting. All right, so there's all types of avenues you can take on this. I think what we need to start out with today is explaining our current political system in the United States being a two-party system, the Republicans and Democrats, and going through and talking about how those political parties got started, where they came from, why they exist. We're going to kind of get started there because a lot of what we're going to do from that point on for the rest of this unit is going to build off of the ideas of the Republicans and the Democrats. So today, we're going to get started here. We start talking about political parties, elections, voting, and talk about Republicans and Democrats. Where'd they come from? Let's get started. All right. So Unit 4 here, political parties and elections. So this picture right here, this is of a donkey and an elephant. You probably see this a lot. You may not if you're not into politics, but they represent the Republicans and the Democrats. So one of the things I want to talk about today as we go through and tell the story how they came out is where these actual symbols came from and why they're still used today. But we need to get started, all right? And there's no better way of talking about American politics than old George Washington. So the best place to start at when we're talking about political parties is when there was no political parties. When George Washington, the first president of the United States, was the president, he has some very interesting insights on political parties. George Washington's view on political parties is that he's not a huge fan of them. So here's what political parties are, the definition, right? Is a group of people with broad common interest who organize to win elections, control government, and thereby influence government policies. So basically a group of people with, generally speaking, they have the same ideas and they all vote in big clumps because voting is the backbone of American democracy, the ability to vote. So if you can get a group of people to vote in unison on all these different things, that is a very powerful thing to have. That is, very simply speaking, what a political party is. It's just a huge group of people that vote the same way. So it gives you a lot of power if they're all voting the same way. So George Washington, he was not in a political party. He didn't have one. He was actually adamantly against it and was very firm in his opposition, saying that political parties could lead to bad things. So here his famous quote that he says really in his farewell speech when he's leaving office in 1796 is that political parties may now and then answer popular ends. Like they may be necessary every now and then, but they're likely over the course of time and things to become potential engines by which cunning, ambitious, and unprincipled men will be enabled to subvert the power of the people and to usurp for themselves the reins of government, destroying afterwards the very engines that have lifted them to unjust dominion. All right, I may have lost you there after about 10 words. Basically, he's saying that the problem with political parties is while on the surface they may look like a good thing, and they may work out sometimes, it may just be a machine that allows bad guys to rise to power. That is his fear. He has seen this happen in other parts of the world, and he's like, you shouldn't do that. This is one of the few things that Abraham Lincoln, look at me messing. We are going to talk about him today, though. But that George Washington says that basically gets completely ignored. He thinks if you have political parties, it's going to divide America. If you have different teams, which is like what political parties are, then you have some Americans joining this team and some Americans joining this team. And basically you have divided yourself in America and against other Americans. And that is Abraham, look, I'm doing it again. Not Abraham Lincoln, George Washington. I got his picture right here. That is what George Washington's concern was the fact that it would just divide America and actually be counterintuitive to the idea of unity, which is what he wanted America to have. So the question here is, why did George Washington believe that political parties were bad for America? And do you think he was right? So this is an early on question because we haven't talked a whole lot about it. We're going to spend a whole unit talking about political parties. But I'm interested to know what your thoughts are on this. So pause me, answer that in complete sentences, and we're going to move on. So this brings us to Hamilton and Jefferson. This don't take long at all. So remember, George Washington did not like political parties. He's completely against it. So his cabinet, basically his group of advisors, are these guys right here: Secretary of State, Secretary of Treasury, Secretary of War, and the Attorney General. You can basically ignore the Secretary of War and the Attorney General here, Edmund Randolph and Henry Knox. They're not really part of the story. Thomas Jefferson and Alexander Hamilton are very important here. So, to simplify the story, Alexander Hamilton is the Secretary of Treasury. He's in charge of raising money for America. We have to pay back like France after the Revolutionary War. Thomas Jefferson, Secretary of State, his job is basically to interact and be in between with other countries. Well, both of these men, Alexander Hamilton and Thomas Jefferson, both wrote the Constitution. They were both intricately involved with the writing of it. So Alexander Hamilton, he's like, oh, you know what would be a good way to raise money? Is if we had a national bank. Basically, all the tax money goes into the bank, and then banks, that national bank, can loan that money out to people, charge interest, and get more money. So you're taking tax money and then loaning it back out to the same people paying taxes, and that when they pay it back with interest, you gain more money. It's like, this seems like a great idea. Thomas Jefferson is going to lose his mind over this, all right? He thinks the national bank is the worst possible thing that you can have, all right? So here's the two views on the national bank, which seems kind of odd because has nothing to do with Thomas Jefferson's job. But Thomas Jefferson says, we wrote the Constitution. That is not what the Constitution says you can do. And Hamilton's like, yeah, it does say I can do it because it doesn't say I can't. This is the whole idea of loose constructionists versus strict constructionists that we're not going to get into right now. But Alexander Hamilton wanted a national bank. Thomas Jefferson didn't. They both worked for George Washington, the first president. Thomas Jefferson is so angry that this is allowed to happen and this is going to happen because George Washington's like, if Alexander Hamilton wants it and he's in charge of it, and Alexander Hamilton says it's constitutional, that's fine. Because Alexander Hamilton believes as long as it doesn't say you can't do something in the Constitution, you're good to do it. Whereas Jefferson says the only thing you're allowed to do is exactly what's expressly written in the Constitution. Basically, do you ask for permission or do you ask for forgiveness? It's the same mentality there. The reason this is so important that they argue over the national bank is because it goes back to the Constitution. Not only did both these men write the Constitution and they disagree over what it means, all right? And here's the clash of the cabinet. Thomas Jefferson is going to quit. He's the first Secretary of State we've ever had in the history of the United States. He's the first one ever, under George Washington, and he quits because he can't stand Alexander Hamilton, all right? And he quits. He's going to come back, and we have mentioned this in the previous unit, and he's going to come back in 1796 and run for re-election or run for election as the president himself against John Adams, which was George Washington's vice president. He's going to lose, and then he's going to win in 1800. But here's what's interesting. Thomas Jefferson goes and creates his own political party. He calls themselves Republicans. Now, here's where it gets a little confusing, so just bear with me. Because they are in no way related to the Republicans that we have today, we don't call them Republicans in history. We don't, just try not to confuse you. So we call them either, that's right, one or two things. It's either the Jeffersonian Republicans or the Democratic Republicans, because as us as historians try not to confuse the population, we can't even agree on what we're going to call these people. But Thomas Jefferson called himself a Republican at the time, but since they're in no relation to the Republicans we're going to talk about here in a minute, we kind of changed that in history. So it's just Jefferson's Republicans. He wants a small government. He doesn't like Hamilton and the people that are Federalist, all right? So here's a list of their two different versions of the different things that they believe. They both go out, they try to recruit large amounts of voters to vote for them. all right, and immediately create political parties, like almost instantly. This is right as George Washington is like, let's not have political parties. This is happening at the same time. They're going out to create political parties. So almost immediately, even though everybody loves George Washington and everything that he did for the most part was successful as far as the founding of America, this is one of the things everybody just ignores. And while he is president, basically his own cabinet breaks off and becomes the first two political parties. You have like the Federalist, which is Hamilton, and then you're going to have the Republicans or the Democratic Republicans or the Jeffersonian Republicans that are Jefferson. And they have basically divided the country in half. Who do you support? Jefferson or Hamilton? So almost instantaneously, we're going to get political parties. So you can tell early on that this idea of having a political party, of galvanizing a group of people to vote consistently together on topics, is something that is kind of foreshadowing. It's going to stick in American history. So the question is, why did Jefferson and Hamilton argue over a document they both helped to write? What was it they disagreed about? The reason I put this question on here, and it might seem a little tricky, it is really important to understand that these two men who wrote the Constitution immediately argued over what it meant. All right, they argued over the National Bank, and Thomas Jefferson thought that was too much power. It would give too much power to the federal government. Alexander Hamilton thought it was a neat way to make money. That was the argument, and that could be the answer here to the question. I'll go ahead and give that one to you. But what is important to understand, the men who wrote the Constitution immediately, just a couple years later, argued over what it meant. So whenever we today were like, the founding fathers intended this to be, you don't know. They didn't know. Thomas Jefferson and Alexander Hamilton, two of the most influential people who wrote the Constitution, disagreed about it viciously for their entire lives afterwards. So we can't always just assume that we knew exactly what the founding fathers meant every time an issue comes up. So that story is important to talk about how quickly this idea of political parties comes out. There's some that come and go in American history, like the Whigs that we'll probably mention here in a second, but they're not really that necessary. There's some know-nothing parties and some other stuff like that. But let's get to the crux of what we need to talk about today, Republicans and Democrats. All right, so let's fast forward from this story right here. All right, we're in the mid-1830s, so we're going almost 40 years into the future. All right, 35, 40 years into the future, 1830s. There is this dude, well, I guess it's re-election. Let me just, there's this dude right here. The dude that's dressed like a vampire. That's Andrew Jackson. Andrew Jackson, all right, in 1828, is going to run for president. Now, he's really the first person that's going to run for president who didn't like sign the Declaration of Independence or part of writing the Constitution. All the presidents, and he'll be the seventh president. All the six previous presidents were all people who had written the Constitution. He's going to be the first one that doesn't. So basically, if you're running for president and you're like helped write the Constitution, you're basically a shoo-in. Well, those guys at this point have pretty much died off, all right, because that was back at this point 50 years ago almost, 40 years ago at this point in history in 1828. Andrew Jackson is already super famous, as you can see with the picture here above, the War of 1812. He was a war hero. In the War of 1812, he recaptured and defended New Orleans from the British. All you need to know is he is a war hero. He is not classically educated. He's a smart man, but he is a country dude from the South. He's actually from North Carolina. And he is very much, I joke around in my class, like he's a redneck. He's like, woo! Like, he is not your typical aristocrat. He is the complete opposite of that. He is an everyday guy, even though he is wealthy, he is affluent, he is a war hero. He connects with the modern man. He's not somebody that wrote the Constitution. He's just a guy that went out and fought, and people are galvanized by that. He is so drastically different than anybody that we've ever had. He comes in and Congress can't stand him. They think he's awful. All his ideas are horrific. But the American people love him. The reason the American people love him is because he's a whole lot more like the average Joe than any other president that we've ever had. So even though he's going to make some questionable decisions, and that's putting it nicely in retrospect, the Trail of Tears is pretty epically horrific, which we'll talk about in U.S. history. But he becomes the president. Now, he gets a group of people together, like a political party, right? Because they're kind of loosely aligned at that point, and he calls himself a Democrat, all right? So he's from the South, from country, and he calls himself a Democrat. He is so disliked by his opposition, the people that are running against him, all right, that they call him a jackass. Like, you're a jackass. And you're like, Mr. Wagstaff, there's an important reason I have to use that word here in history class, because when they call him that, his response instead of getting offended is, I like it. Let's make that our official mascot of the Democrat Party. He's the first Democrat because of his abrasive personality. He is called a jackass, which is another term for a donkey. And he likes it so much that it becomes the official symbol of the Democratic Party, which still exists today. So there's the elephant and there's the donkey. The Democrat Party comes out first. And Andrew Jackson is the first Democrat. All right. So the question here is, why was Jackson and the Democrats so powerful that they weren't typical politicians? What does this show about the national government and who controls the power in America? He was incredibly powerful. All the politicians couldn't stand Jackson because he was so different. But he won huge because at the end of the day, the American people liked him. And this is a good sign as far as a democracy goes with the way we wanted it run. This is not a country that's going to be run by elites. This is a country that is run by the American people. And this shows it here at this time with Andrew Jackson as the 7th president of the United States. You don't have to be a typical politician. If you have enough support, you can win. So the Democrats, typically very southern-based, rural, very, very conservative way they had done things. So answer that in 2 questions, answer that in 2 sentences, and pause me, and we're moving on. All right, so let's talk about the creation of the Republican Party. So at the end of this lesson, we'll have the Republicans and the Democrats. So the Democrats were unified. They would run against groups like Free Soilers, Whigs. The Democrats had success, all right? Now, the big issue at the time, massive issue, the elephant in the room, that is not intentional to use the word elephant when we're getting to talk about the creation of the Republican Party, but it goes, the elephant in the room is slavery. It's the 1800s. The Civil War, where the country goes to war with itself. And 600,000 Americans, now they're saying the guess is 720,000 Americans died in the Civil War, is in large part going to be fought over the concept of slavery. Yes, states' rights, not other stuff. Getting off topic here, but a Civil War does not happen if slavery doesn't exist. That's a whole nother thing, all right? But, so, there is finally a cohesive group that comes together that is anti-slavery in the United States. They're going to join together, and they don't win a whole lot early on. Up north they do, but it's not until the election of 1860 that a Republican, which is a group that is against slavery, actually puts a man that can possibly win the presidential election, and a whole bunch of information that isn't necessary right now for this course. This man, Abraham Lincoln, who is a Republican, who is against slavery, is elected in 1860. His actual election is what's going to spur the start of the Civil War, because the South is upset. There's a person who is against slavery that is in the federal government. We'll talk about this particular election later on. But Abraham Lincoln is the first Republican, all right? Now, unlike Jackson, all right, where he's running for president and they call him a jackass, and he's like, we're going to use the donkey as our symbol. So even though Abraham Lincoln is the first Republican, and this political party will stay for a while because they're part of the North, the reason they're called the elephants is not as straightforward as that. basically, since the North is going to win the Civil War and they're really going to control politics for a while, from the Civil War on, the Republicans basically win every election for a while. So by the 1880s, there is this newspaper cartoon drawer guy named Thomas Nast. He's involved in some other stuff, and we're actually going to talk about him later on, Political Machines, in this unit. A very famous cartoonist, influenced a bunch of stuff. Whenever he's drawing cartoons about the Republican voters, because they're so powerful, there's so many of them, right, that all vote in unison, the symbol he commonly uses to represent Republican voting blocks in his cartoons would be the elephant, because they were so powerful at the time in unison when they would vote. So about 20 years after Abraham Lincoln, the symbol of the elephant for the Republicans sticks with the Republican Party. And so today, the two symbols for the two groups is the elephant and the donkey. The elephant being the Republicans and the donkey being, why they picked animals, I don't know. I don't know why the animals have stuck. But the elephant is the Republicans and the donkey, or the jackass, is the Democrats. Now, I should point out, because we'll talk about this later, when they were first developed, all right, and we'll talk about the difference in liberal and conservative, the Democrats are the very conservative part of the society, and the Republicans are the extremely liberal part of society around the time of Abraham Lincoln. That's going to change pretty drastically up to modern day. It's almost flipped, but the political parties remain the same. It's a little bit confusing, but we're going to walk through there when we get there. So the question here is, what is the main connecting issues for those that formed the Republican Party? What did they hold dear to their hearts? What was that one issue? This is slavery. And explain what they felt about that, and what was their belief on slavery. All right, what unified them about slavery? So answer that in complete sentences. So we basically kind of introduced the two political parties here today in America, the Republicans and the Democrats. And we are going to move forward after this, really talking about them in detail, because that is kind of the foundation. We talk about political parties in America. You have to talk about Republicans and Democrats, because so much of their influence affects the way society is run today politically. All right, that's as far as we're going to get. See you guys tomorrow.